sit in that chair. This side's better.
I just like throwing you off, John.
Okay, well,
So
do my best.
we're having this chat and really, focusing the topic on what happens when things go wrong. What happens when we have a plan but things go awry? And I remember we were chatting about this. You actually had the idea for this topic, and I'm just curious, why? Why do you think it's a good thing to talk about when things go wrong?
Well, I think so. We come to these conferences, right, and we hear all these wonderful speakers, and we get all this great info and ways to do things, and that's really exciting. But I also have this bit of guilt or shame that when it's my world is not perfect. I don't always get to do the right product discovery process, or I don't always do the A/B test because I don't have time, and things happen and things change. So for me, I just wanted us kind of to have a together collective sigh moment here where we could just say yes, things don't always go as planned. Things sometimes change and go off course, and as much as we aspire to best practices and do things the way we know we should, that's not always what's going to happen. So that's what I was thinking.
Well, I appreciate, maybe in John's honor here, we should do a little breathe in and breathe out. A little
Thank
collective
you. It's been
sigh.
a rough couple weeks for me, so I appreciate that.
Well, so on that note, so sometimes things don't go as planned. I guess let's talk about the planning, right? We're all product people. You in your role as chief product officer, I imagine you do start with planning in some ways for various things. Maybe you could just talk about what kind of planning do you even go through to begin with, and then we could talk about what happens when those plans go awry.
Sure. So I think, I've mostly been at startups, so I'm not, at the big public companies. My experience is more 0 to 1 or, early stage. So things change pretty quickly, but we do planning. We do, strategic planning where we're thinking about the next year or 2 or even 3. We are, on my product teams, we're doing pretty in-depth quarterly planning. So we just finished up a quarterly planning process where all the Scrum teams submitted and we reviewed the quarterly plans. At a company level, we do OKRs, company level OKRs. So maybe you've heard of that, objectives and key results, which kind of came out of Intel back in the 70s, and Google is famous for doing that. So yeah, we put these different sort of types of plans together with different horizons, quarterly to multi-year. And yeah, they tend to, as soon as they're made, they're instantly out of date.
Well, so on that note, how often do those plans change?
Oh, I'm not kidding. One of the things that I always, and this every quarter I have the same speech, because we'll do the roadmaps and we'll have a company all hands and we'll present the roadmaps. And the first thing I say is don't get married to these roadmaps. If something is in here that you've lobbied for and championed, don't get too attached to it, because in a day or 2 or a week we're going to get some new information, because at a startup information changes and new things come in. You learn new things, and so it's going to change. So you really got to just be ready to go.
There's a quote, and I don't even know if he actually said this, but if you see in the description in the app, I put it in there. It's by the very eloquently spoken Mike Tyson that says, everybody has a plan until you get punched in the face. And so what's your take on what do you do when you get punched in the face? Put yourself back in a time where something went wrong, stuff didn't go the way that you needed it to. Literally, what do you do?
So there's personal things that I need to do to just manage my psychology a lot of times, and then there's things we need to do at work to handle the change. So one of the things I do on the personal side is I just remember when I go home, I have 2 young girls and a wife, and I know that they're going to be there for me, and no matter what happens at work, I'm going to get that hug at the end of the day. So. And then I, also on the personal side, I try and work out every morning. I try and meditate, all these kind of things just to keep me sort of level, because I know that change is coming. But on the work side, on the the day-to-day. I mean, when something changes, it's never the same, right? Or it's rarely the exact same thing. So you just kind of got to roll with it. I mean, one of the vectors for change, I guess, is people leaving or quitting, or I had someone quit this past week, gave me 4 days notice. Thank you very much. But I guess nowadays I'm just a little bit trying to be, I know that, that hurts, and there's like that moment of like, oh my God, what are we gonna do? But I've just been around long enough where I know, like, when people leave, like, you just kind of figure out, who can take that on, like, how do you, get a backfill, job request up. So there's just, certain activities that you can just kind of go after. And I think same with like when the roadmap changes, you just look for, it's kind of a boring answer, but you kind of just look for, like, how do we move people onto that thing that needs to happen now? And how do we, if you guys ever heard of that book, Extreme Ownership, by like the Navy SEAL guy, Jocko, who's kind of crazy. But there's one thing that when I read that book that I took away that is super, like, it's really changed how I look at things. It's like, be decisive in chaos. So when things are changing and things are like out of hand, like, I don't think I'm a super decisive person. I tend to like think things through more than just making on-the-fly decisions. But now I'm thinking for myself when chaos happens and things change, like, how can I be more decisive? How can I like run at the problem a little faster?
Are there things that we should all be mindful of? Like, let's just say, something happens. Like, maybe there's a product that we were working on, supposed to launch. We know that launch isn't going to happen. Are there things we shouldn't do? Like, what are the things that, you talked about kind of some of the do's. Like, you have to just execute at this point. You have to, figure out the ways to make it right. But what should we be careful that we're not doing? Like, what might set us back when we're in these moments of chaos?
Yeah, so I think that's the biggest, I would say, as a person who, reports to the CEO and the board, but also has people reporting to me, I would just say never surprise your boss, never surprise your manager. I had a project just recently. It's like supposed to be like a 3 or 4 month project, but super high exposure for the company. I'm presenting it at board meetings, like, this is what we're doing. Everybody knows about it. It was supposed to launch like October 8th, and I got like last week, it's gonna be a 2-month delay. I was like, what the fuck? Why are you telling me this 1 week before it's supposed to like launch, and we've been working on it forever? And so, and then, I have to go tell, my boss. So I think like the very biggest thing to do when managing change is make sure that people aren't surprised, especially, maybe your boss. And so, I think there's a couple things there. Like, one, when things start to slip or when there might be risk introduced to the project, like, just be talking about that. It's kind of like boiling the frog with your boss, right? Like, just every day, like, hey, this thing, I want to keep an eye on this. I want to bring that on your radar. Just so if things get delayed, no one's like, why did that happen? Why am I being surprised by this? I can't remember what the other thing was.
No, and I'm curious, like, we're talking about these things, the do's, the don'ts, but like, can we even prevent it? Is this just going to happen? We know, like, a truth is that stuff will happen, and we're just going to have to deal with it. Like, or are there things that we can do to sort of set things in place where we can prevent these major changes? I have a feeling I know the answer, but I'm just curious your thoughts.
Well, I don't know if you know the answer, because I don't know it. I'm kind of making it up. I think there's definitely there are certain things that you need to have a lot of predictability over. So when there's an external launch where you're spending a bunch of marketing dollars and you're going to be kind of landing a bunch of planes at the right time, you need to be very predictable and really understand what's happening. So I would spend more time in estimation. I would track that project a lot more closely. Put more process in place. But I think for most of the projects that we do at Varo and previously at TaskRabbit, most of them weren't like that big bang, launches. So they were more, iterations and smaller projects. And in those cases, we We tend to value velocity over predictability. So we're okay when things slip or change, or we're expecting things to slip or change, and that's okay. Usually they slip, rarely they go earlier, but it can happen. So I think it's just kind of having the process in place, having the people in place who can handle that, and communication is just, again, to the previous point, number one.
By the way, I want to have one more question for John. I think we'll have time for a couple questions from the audience too, so you could start to think about that. I think that would be a good opportunity. But I guess the one thing I wanted to ask you, we do have folks in the audience that are at the product manager level, some are at that director VP level, some CPOs. If there is some sort of, you want them to walk away with just one thing, like if they're going to take away anything about when it comes to dealing with change, what might that be?
Have you guys heard of VUCA? So it's I guess it's like some business school thing, but it's volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. And I think if you're going to be in product, especially at startups, like you need to kind of wrap your head around your comfort level with those things. So when I'm hiring people, I try and get a sense of their comfort with, because volatility, like we're just talking about, everything changes. Uncertainty, like, at startups, you don't even know if you're going to exist in a year, like if you're going to get that next round of funding, or if you're going to achieve your milestones or achieve profitability. Complexity, I mean, these days you have iOS, Android, web, internal tools, you have, a lot of integrations with partners and vendors. So it's just a really complex world. And then I think, unless I think you're at a later stage company, there's a ton of ambiguity. If you're a product manager, like my product teams, everybody always wants really clear defined roles and runways and who owns exactly this and that, but it's not always clear. There's overlap in some of these Scrum teams and some of these product owners and some of these roles, and you have to kind of work it out as you go. Not everything's going to fit exactly perfectly on a map. So I think the one thing I would say to take away is to not necessarily shy away from VUCA or those things, but kind of embrace them, kind of think about how to expect them, how to build processes that are expecting those things to happen and for these types of situations to occur. So don't be afraid of VUCA.
I like it. Don't be afraid of VUCA. Okay.
I want to say it in a Mike Tyson impression, but I don't think I can do it. Don't be afraid of VUCA.
Well, you just did it.
That wasn't very good, though.
I
didn't have the whistle in his voice.
Who has a question for John? I'd love to. Yeah. Go ahead, right here.
I'd be curious on how you work with developers to help both keep them motivated but honest and able to tell you about those timelines. So, for instance, sometimes we've gotten to the end of an iteration and they've been like, in stand-up, everything's fine, no blockers, and then we get to the end and it's suddenly like, this isn't going to get done. But at the same time, I want them to feel safe to be able to communicate that, but I want to also keep them motivated and not necessarily working over hours, but making sure that they're still doing their work so they're not just like, laying back and saying, oh, well, I just, kind of didn't get that done.
I'm going to repeat the question, just make sure everybody could hear it, because it's a great one. And I'll paraphrase, but how do you really sort of empower your team to be able to come to you when there are changes to be made instead of keeping it to themselves?
That is a great question. I think there's a lot of answers there. I think, so one of the things is you want to create a culture in your company, on your teams, where people can be vulnerable, where they can speak truth to power, where they can give feedback to each other. And so I think, as a product manager on a team, the way you do that is to, embody that yourself and be vulnerable and if you make a mistake, I made a mistake, I let you guys down, those requirements weren't up, or my Jira ticket sucked, or whatever it is, be super honest with them and don't keep yourself up on a pedestal. I think create that culture where you guys can be just really honest. Another thing I think on the inspiration part is I always tell my teams not to fall in love with the product or with your team or with a feature or with the logo, but fall in love with the mission, right? So at Varo, our mission is to elevate people's worth and to help them improve their financial situation. So that's what I want to use to like inspire the team and bring our work always back up to that North Star. And I think, if we can just keep tracking to that goal and that vision, then we're okay. Everything's okay. If we miss something or drop the ball on something, that's okay as long as we keep pushing and moving towards that. So that's the way I would inspire. And then I think it's the cultural thing, and I think I would like do a retrospective on that if you're getting to the end of a sprint or some sort of commitment, and they're like, nothing's done. Like, why didn't we know this earlier? And did you guys think that earlier? Did I do something? Was I just pushing too hard on this date where you didn't feel like you could tell me? Like, I break that down and try and figure out what's going on there.
That's great. Another question? Yes.
I'm curious, just in a startup context, when everything's moving so quickly, and you have to keep working with this team, that it can be hard to find the time to talk about when things go wrong, why they go wrong, and how to improve the process to just have something new to take on. I'm curious how you think about building in that time or finding that time to talk about what went wrong without bringing down morale and while still
Again, I'll repeat it just so everybody can hear. The question is, especially for a startup where things are moving so fast, how do you make the time to even talk about when things go wrong without getting morale down too?
So, of all the agile, we do some, everyone does agile, but no one really does agile. So of all the agile ceremonies we do, I think the retrospective is the most important one, but it's also the easiest to skip because it's, if you skip the retro, you're still going to have, tickets you're working on next sprint because you've done that in planning and grooming. And so it's easy to skip the retro. But it's really the most valuable when you can all look back, you can talk through, you can kind of make some new, commitments for how to improve, pick a couple from that. So I don't go to every Scrum ceremony. We have like 7 Scrum teams, I guess, now, or 8. So I just, every once in a while, I'll go through a sprint of going to all the ceremonies, and I always am really just looking for that retro. Is that retro delivering? Are we really thinking about that sprint that just happened and really trying to improve? Because Agile, I think of everything that you could say about Agile, the best part about it is it sort of should be a self-healing, iterative system, but it only is if you do those retros. If each team can get better and find out their own idiosyncrasies and quirks, and the retro will just help you kind of like dial them in and get better and figure out what wasn't working. And so, I just really, that's the one thing that I'm kind of, a nut about, is making sure that the teams do that. But they still skip it. But then I don't skip.
We have time for a couple more questions. Yeah.
I just wanted to go back real quick to something you said about valuing velocity over predictability. We've been tracking velocity in order to get to predictability. Like, can you just tell me a little bit more about what you meant by that?
And I'll repeat, the question was going back to what John had said about valuing velocity over predictability. So I'll let you talk about that.
I mean, it's not like, it's a guideline more than a rule. Like, I'd like, in a perfect world, you're both predictable and high velocity. But I think for us, it means we're not spending a ton of time doing estimation. And quite frankly, I think in our situation, we're not very good at estimating. I think in general in our industry, we're not very good at estimating. So spending more time in estimation might not be the most efficient thing. So we just spend a little bit of time on estimation, unless it's like some big bang project, and then we just get to work. Let's go. But I do think I am a big fan of tracking team velocity and figuring out what your capacity is for every sprint and getting more accurate at that. I'm a big fan of things like planning poker, where a team is estimating together and getting, when there's a difference in opinion, they're talking it out and trying to figure out, why do you think it's a 2 and I think it's a 13? They're kind of figuring that out, working it through. I think it's a great way to build, shared vocabulary and shared understanding of the code base or of the customer, things you're working on. So I don't think it's a either or. It's kind of like I think if you just have to pick one or be sort of honest with yourself, I would, in our situation, it's velocity over predictability. I think if you're building, a space shuttle or a dialysis machine or something like that, maybe it's the other way around. Maybe you want to be super predictable, and velocity is, more fungible.
We have time for one more question. Any other questions? Yes.
So you talk about culture. So I think one of the things that probably I face a lot is how do you get good feedback, especially if you have influence? Because people just say, "Oh, it's good. What do you think? It's good. I want more." So we talk about culture of vulnerability and openness. How do you overcome that?
Just to repeat, the question was, how do you set a culture so that people are open with you, they're being honest with you, they're actually sharing real feedback, maybe not sugarcoating things?
Great question. I'm a big fan of feedback and feedback frameworks and things like that. So, I used to always end my one-on-ones with my team and with my boss or really with anyone. Do you have any feedback for me? And sometimes I'd get something, sometimes I wouldn't. And then someone kind of gave me this tip, if you just ask for feedback, you kind of never, it's rare you're going to get it. People will know you value feedback, but you sort of have to ask more specific things. So to one of my direct reports, I thought we were having a really, great relationship, and we got along very well, and we were all on the same page. And then our head of HR said, "Hey, you and so-and-so, there's some tension there, huh?" And I'm like, "What are you talking about? Everything's great. I ask for feedback at every one-on-one, I never get any, things are great, everything's great." And so this head of HR gave me this tip, don't just ask for feedback, ask, "Hey, in situation so-and-so, how did I show up for you? Was I there in a way that was helpful? Did I do my job as your boss in that role? Or what could I have done better, when XYZ happened?" And it was the next one-on-one, I was "Oh my God," I got, it just changed our relationship. I totally understood that I was completely letting her down in a way that she was expecting me as her boss to be more of a stronger advocate for her in this certain situation. And I just thought, I just was totally oblivious to that. So I think that the takeaway for me was asking for feedback generally is generally not going to get you a lot of great feedback, but getting more specific and kind of poking at it, asking questions in different ways is a way to really help you get more valuable. And I think that works in one-on-ones as well as group situations. One last thing I'll add, because I know we're getting close, is I think it's really important that whatever the HR, the people function, or even just as a product leader with a team, that you get your team good at feedback. So I think it's worth, we used to TaskRabbit, we used to send people to a 2-day program called the Middle Path. That was a way people could learn how to have hard conversations with each other. They would learn a bunch of the same language and terms, victim trap or knower's trap, all these shared language that we had, so we could label things when they were happening and then kind of move on. So I think investing in either outside instructors to help with feedback, or you as a leader or someone who even leading a Scrum team, let's talk about how we're going to give feedback and look at some of the frameworks and talk about that with the team, because it really does pay off. And then it goes back to the retrospective too. I think it's, if you're not talking about these things, that how you could get better, you as an individual, you as a team, it's going to be really hard to get better. So,
well, John, I appreciate the time. Let's hear it for John Vars.